Well, let's just say that Resi 5 didn't exactly start off on the best footing ever. Back in the nicer days of the internet when the hype was going around for Resi 5, which was back in like 2008, when the PS3 just launched, Capcom ran into a little bit of a controversy with Resi 5 when it featured the first part of the game, a siege type of scenario against African zombies being murdered by white bread protagonist Chris Redfield, muscled up to the nth degree. It wasn't as big as the Ubisoft female controversy, but it did raise some eyebrows at least, which I found kind of quaint in comparison, due to the fact that at the game's 1/3 mark, you'll be murdering the same African zombies wearing tribal masks and grass skirts, throwing spears at you, and they're in huts made of sticks, so the actual racist part of the game that was in the trailer wasn't even the point of maximum racism possibility. Like with most of Capcom's stupidest narrative missteps, they did attempt to explain it with a diary that basically said that when the villagers were being infected by the virus, they decided to dress up like their ancestral warriors and use the old techniques to murder all of the outsiders, which is a classic example of explaining something by not explaining something. For a more modern example, remember breathing through her skin. Anyway, while it was an incredibly dumb move on Capcom's part to center a whole game around ancestral African zombie murder, it was done more out of incompetence than out-and-out hatred of black people, so I'm going to give Capcom mainly a slide on that. Plus, there are other missteps with Resi 5 that we could talk about, and the first major issue is how unfortunate it must have been for Resi 5 to be put in the same position that MGS4 was in, coincidentally, around the same time as that game's launch, where Capcom made its next big iteration's main goal to wrap up every single loose plot thread and character from the entire franchise, and then burn the entire thing never to be seen again. Technically, this is true and not true because the game spends a lot of time hammering you over the head with the history of Umbrella and the T-Virus's origin story, but it turned out that a lot of the important characters are already dead or totally caught up on their own character arcs, so there's actually not a lot for Resi 5 to wrap up beyond a couple character deaths, whereas MGS4 had to spend excruciating amounts of cutscenes trying to get everybody and everything on screen before Solid Snake's inevitable death. Press F to pay respects. While Resi 5 is wasting its screen time banging you over the head with a history that really didn't need to be told, who the hell actually gives a shit that the T-Virus originated from an African cave flower? It's also running headlong into another problem that is trying to recapture the lightning in a bottle that was Resi 4 with a looser game experience. While it's not totally obvious, and probably not even totally intentional, there are a bunch of cues being taken from Capcom's last Dynamite instant bestseller that Resi 5 tried in recreating and inevitably came up as the inferior version. Capcom brought back the insta-kill chainsaw enemy, the siege house moment is now a holdout mission in the African village, you have to fight yet another sea monster with a turret section, you have the treasure selling mechanic, and the escort mission returns. You've got the rural village locales move from Spain to Africa. Most of the weapons from Resi 4 make a return and behave in similar fashions. A multi-faced rogues gallery that inevitably become Ouroboros monsters. Ouroboros itself is basically a Las Plagas ripoff. The QT additional combat attacks, the enemies that have their head burst out into giant parasites. Unfortunately, one of the areas that Resi 5 didn't pick up from Resi 4 was the attaché case inventory system, and instead, Resi 5's version is vastly inferior to it, and honestly is a bastardization of inventory systems across all of video games. Instead of being able to move around and sort your inventory to maximize what you were carrying in an intuitive menu, in Resi 5 you simply get 9 inventory slots and just have to deal with the constant restrictions of that, and what makes it even stupider is that certain items like herbs don't stack, and if you want to wear additional armor, it costs you one of your slots, permanently making something that used to be restrictive even worse. Resi 5's inventory is a horrible system that ends up only annoying the player constantly with inventory management, and not being able to carry an appropriate amount of highly useful weapons and ammo amongst other things. And it ends up looking even stupider than that when this game's Chris Redfield is the most jacked up version, yet with his biceps being larger than his head. You can tell me that the inventory system in the original trilogy was even more restrictive, which in fact is true, but the way that the original game balanced that out was that you weren't constantly picking up items like in these action-based Resi games, and, the most part, the inventory management was an appropriate addition to the difficulty of the game, and made more tactical sense, making you think of what assortment of items would be your best bet to survive and progress the fastest, which ultimately is not a part of Resi 5. Resident Evil 5 isn't built like your typical survival game. You're constantly fighting zombies, so you constantly need ammunition. Therefore, you constantly need to be picking up items and stopping to do the management thing while you are more than likely not in the middle of a firefight, ends up being a petty annoyance rather than a natural extension of the difficulty curve. I suppose since we are tearing into the weaker parts of Resi 5, we should have a rundown of the actual plot of the game to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, so Chris Redfield is sent out with several military divisions of the BSAA to investigate the usual mysterious disappearances in a sort of out-of-the-way African city where he's being given a new partner, Sheva, who is trying her hardest to be a badass female character a la Jill Valentine, but doesn't exactly hit that mark. They quickly discover the new batch of pseudo-intelligent zombies ruining the city and killing all of the other squads that the BSAA sent with Chris and Jill, and once safety has been relatively established and all the zombies have been murdered, they are tasked with continuing the mission of looking for an informant working with Tricell, the stand-in company for Umbrella, on what has been causing the bioweapon disaster. The pair chase him down until he dies and then gain a lead looking for the Tricell executive Excella, and begin investigating that lead until the point where they learn that the new virus creating the zombies, Ouroboros, some sort of leech-based parasite, is becoming a global problem headed up by Albert Wesker, the ultimate antagonist. Along the way, Chris learns that the presumed dead Jill Valentine is possibly alive, and just to cut a long and stupidly contrived plot short, she is alive but mind-controlled and working with Tricell and Wesker to basically be a high-level enforcer of its will. The plan is defeated by the end of the game, the global nuclear Ouroboros missile is melted, and the final spoiler alert, Albert Wesker gets killed in a volcano-based ridiculous em-up and dual rocket launcher collision. And since she was mentioned, we should talk about Capcom's AI design for Sheva throughout the game, and exactly like how I think Assassin's Creed was fixed after the fact, I think that Capcom went back and tried to repair their original work with Sheva, and ultimately half-assed the job. From what I've heard about the game when it launched, it seemed like Sheva's AI was a lot worse than it is now, and the way that it is when I played is still not good. She doesn't heal you at the slightest injury, but there is no warning when you are going to get healed by her, and it's up to her discretion if she does have healing items, so you don't get a choice in that matter, and since healing items aren't super common throughout a mission, this can get rather annoying. But you are allowed to buy way more first aid sprays in the middle of missions than in Resi 4. However, the most annoying thing about Sheva is her near-complete lack of any self-preservation instinct and how her AI decides to use weapons. See, if she has ammo for it, Sheva will always default to her pistol as a gun, even if she has ammo for her shotgun, rifle, or anything else you happen to give her, which might have been Capcom's way to prioritize giving the most valuable ammo to the player and not have her waste it. However, if her AI was designed to effectively use the gun she has in the situation present, then this really wouldn't have been an issue that a workaround would have needed to be in the game, because I would rather have someone competently be able to use the guns rather than the ammo always be available to me, even though I'm using a totally different gun, and Sheva's AI is trying to use a pistol to fight lickers, which are the absolute worst in Resi 5. The whole pistol default thing would be fine if it were just in the first few levels, but this persists even during the end game when things like lickers and those insta-kill insects start entering the picture, and higher tech is going to be required. At the very least, I can say that Sheva doesn't die or get hurt a ton throughout the game, so losing because she died is surprisingly a rare occurrence. But frankly, her total inability to prioritize targets and be an effective shot is one of the biggest reasons why you'll want to be doing the game co-op if it's at all possible. I think the game might actually reduce the enemy numbers while playing in single player just to really underline how totally useless even Capcom thinks Sheva is at fighting zombies. It's kind of a shame, since her voice actor really did try to make this character the black version of Jill. To help explain why, in spite of doing so many things so similar to Resi 4, Resi 5 didn't live up to the lofty masterpiece grade of its predecessor, is pretty simple actually. It's because Resi 5 took itself seriously, while Resi 4 was a B-movie level goof fest with grand characters playing up the stage acting. Resi 5 is trying to do a similar take on the zombie parasite taking over the world, but they're treating it like an actual threat and trying to tie in political intrigues and intimidating antagonists, and it mostly falls flat. An example would be how in Resi 4, the monks were enemies that Leon was able to just bully around, shoot in the knees, and then suplex them, whereas the ancestral villagers in Resi 5 are cornering you on all sides, making you survive your way out, and the total lack of suplexes doesn't really work. I really can't be scared of a gray dude in a tribal mask trying to jump and impale me with a giant spear. The other big issue is that Resi 5 lacks the originality and variety of gameplay that Resi 4 had, and when it decides to lift wholesale from Resi 4 to replace that lost variety looks pathetic. Like, did Resi 5 really need to have its own Dr. Salvatore who looked like he just wrapped up his head in old socks? I will say that in spite of the many ways that Resi 5 is not Resi 4, the game is still solid enough of a game and one that'll fit in somewhat nicely to the main franchise of Resident Evil. It may be the Halo 4 of its series, but it's still a decent enough place to be, and that's not to say that Resi 5 doesn't have any new ideas. The combo final boss was pretty cool between the fight with Jill Valentine, Albert Wesker, and then Albert's final form in that volcano was pretty creative. Not always in a good way, but it still had new ideas. The monster design is still damn great, and even though the villains would fit better into a game with a comedic bent, the Informant, Excella, and Albert still play pretty well against Chris and Sheva in cutscenes, and some of the cutscenes can go pretty crazy over the top on the action choreography, and that's nice to see in the first HD Resi game of its franchise. But if you're expecting something comparable to the heights of Resi 4, then that is not what you are going to get here. After the instant success of that game, Resi 5 is more like Capcom's attempt to explore what made Resi 4 the amazing game it was, and not really understanding it, and then filling in the leftover holes with explanations to past events in the franchise, and a bunch of new zombies to fight through the desolate streets of screwed up Africa. At the very least, while Resi 5 drags its feet somewhat, you will be getting a longer game out of Resi 5 than other titles in the series, so there is definitely that. While it's a solid enough of a game that you won't be wasting money on buying it, the game is still wishy-washy on committing to its ideas and gameplay, so the quality of the game can fluctuate over time for various reasons, and the game spends a bit too much time on characters and plot ideas that don't get developed enough to stand out by throwing a bunch of ideas in the air and catching about half of them. In terms of Resident Evil overall, Resi 5 is definitely middle of the road stuff, which is a good showing by Resident Evil overall, that if this is the middle line of difficulty, then the value of the series is still going strong after all these years. I recommend the game even more so if you have a constant friend and can get the co-op working, But to finish this up, let's set up the final scoreboard. And send you guys off with a victory for gamers. Thanks for tuning in.